Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Plan C, Ocean Interventions to Address Climate Change. I'm your host, Will Burns, and I'm co-executive director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Anna Modlaner, who is the MRV manager at the Carbon to Sea Initiative. Good afternoon, Anna.
Hi, good morning.
Plan C is a co-sponsored podcast of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University and the Carbon to Sea Initiative. Today's episode focuses on one of my favorite topics, Anna, which is law and policy. While a lot of the discussion recently on governance of marine carbon removal approaches is focused on the role of international treaty regimes, such as the London Convention and Protocol, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the new Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, a lot of mCDR activity is occurring within national waters, and a number of countries are engaged in efforts to both facilitate these activities as well as to effectively regulate them, in many cases with statutes and regulations that never really contemplated any of these approaches. One of these countries is Canada, which is home to a number of marine startup companies as well as entrepreneurial universities that are conducting marine carbon removal research. And Canada also has a robust ocean regulatory system. So I thought it'd be interesting to examine how Canada is navigating marine carbon removal. And we have two excellent guests to help us do so. Sarah Seck, who is a professor of law and Yogis and Ketty Chair in Human Rights Law, as well as a director of the Marine and Environmental Law Institute at Dalhousie University, and Neil Craik, who's a professor at the University of Waterloo with appointments in both the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development and the School of International Affairs. What issues are front and center for you today, Anna?
Yeah, I think as our avid listeners will know, my area of expertise and deep interest is not law and policy, but MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. But certainly MRV is a overarching issue across all challenges in the mCDR space. And I think it'll be interesting to hear how perhaps differently the law and policy people consider MRV and also what lessons we can draw perhaps from other marine and environmental fields that these two guests have engaged on. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And law and policy people always have opinions on everything. So I'm sure we'll find some interesting things, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot. So let's do it.
Hi, this is Anna with a quick editor's note to this episode. Towards the end, our guest mentions the anticipation of a new prime minister. Since this episode was recorded, Mark Carney was chosen as Canada's next prime minister. Let's go.
Sarah and Neil, welcome to Plan C. If we can, let's start with a round of introductions and a bit of context setting. Could both of you introduce yourselves and tell us first about your broader role in carbon dioxide removal, and then your particular interest in marine carbon removal? And then let's start with Sarah.
Great. Hi, I'm Sarah Seck. I'm a professor at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University, and I'm also the director of the Marine Environmental Law Institute. Well, broadly, I've been interested in researching a range of climate law topics, including loss and damage, issues at the ocean climate nexus, responsible business climate action, and human rights-based approaches to triple planetary crisis more broadly. I've started to become drawn into the specific marine carbon dioxide removal issues, partly through some work with David van der Zwag, who was asked to contribute a chapter on Canada in a recent book that's entitled Ocean Carbon Dioxide Removal for Climate Mitigation, the Legal Framework, which was put together by some Sabin Center researchers. So in that context, I have some familiarity with the Canadian situation, and am increasingly interested on how this relates to all of the broader climate and intersecting triple planetary crisis challenges.
Great. Thanks for that, Sarah. Neil?
Hi, I'm Neil Craik. I'm a professor of law at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Um, there, I'm a member of the Waterloo Climate Intervention Strategies Lab. It's a lab mostly of social scientists where we look at different climate intervention scenarios and governance issues across a range of both marine and terrestrial carbon dioxide issues. Most of my research focuses on the protecting and managing the environment and resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is one of the reasons that I'm interested in marine carbon dioxide removal. In that regard, I've done some work recently with MAOPAR, which is a research institute in Atlantic Canada, just putting on webinars on the sort of Canadian perspectives on marine carbon dioxide removal. I've also written recently on interstate benefit sharing in the context of marine carbon dioxide removal. I do a fair amount of work in the BBNJ treaty and on deep seabed mining. And so I'm also interested in the kind of nexus of all of these new and exciting and worrying resource issues in the oceans.
Great, thank you. And for those who don't know, BBNJ stands for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. Did I get that right?
Correct. Sorry.
As the only non-policy person in the room. No worries, we do it too. Too many acronyms in the field. But great, let's start off with the discussion about Canada's current and potential future role in marine CDR. What kind of Canadian research initiatives for marine CDR are, currently really moving the needle, and who are the major actors in the Canadian mCDR landscape, including regulatory, corporate, nonprofit, academic sectors?
Great. I'll start with that one. And I'm going to start with the academic center, so the academic focus. Here at Dalhousie University, a big initiative relating to marine CDR is the Transforming Climate Action Initiative. Now, TCA is part of the Ocean Frontier Institute, which brings together a number of different universities. So Memorial University, the Université de Québec, Rimouski, University of PEI, Laval University are involved in this. And there is quite a bit of funding for ocean science researchers and other aspects of the marine CDR piece. There are, of course, other academic actors. Neil's Institute at Waterloo is a key CDR player generally, I think, and there's work going on at the University of Victoria, UBC, Calgary, and so on. There are quite a number of smaller scale corporate actors involved, and I think actually Neil, in a policy brief that Neil's group put together, they listed 12, although I've seen different numbers depending on how you define it. In terms of some of the key private actors that are sort of on my radar here in the Nova Scotia context, Carbon Run is running some alkalinity enhancement river restoration work. Planetary Technologies is doing ocean alkalinity enhancement work in Halifax Harbour and in other places. Out west, I understand that Solid Carbon is doing some offshore renewable powered direct air capture experiments, and Coastal Carbon is in partnership with the Coastal First Nation and Oceanwise on seaweed carbon sequestration. In Quebec, there's a group working with Captura on testing direct ocean capture. So that's just a sampling, but I think those are some of the key ones. There are a lot of, I think the question of who's involved, if you're looking at the non-governmental organization sector, is sort of diverse. There's COVE supporting marine technology, the marine technology sector more broadly that plays a role. There's WWF that's interested in blue carbon, West Coast environmental law that's concerned about, keeping tabs on how this is playing out. Carbon Removal Canada more broadly produced a Procuring with Purpose report quite recently, and so on. I think Neil has already mentioned MAOPAR, which is also involved. From a regulatory perspective, obviously, there is something to be said about fisheries and oceans, but I'm not going to say much. I think more interestingly, perhaps, is that Natural Resources Canada's Office of Energy Research and Development released a carbon management strategy in 2023, which more broadly speaks to priorities in terms of advancing CDR technologies and recognizes the early potential of ocean-based CDR, but seems to be adopting what I think they even described as kind of an active neutrality policy at the moment, just kind of waiting to see what happens and then we'll figure it out. And then, of course, there's Environment and Climate Change Canada, which is more broadly playing a role, of course, on the climate carbon aspects.
Great, thank you. And you already answered my next question, which would have been which CDR pathways are sort of primarily pursued in Canada. And you obviously listed a great number of them, from river alkalinity enhancement to ocean alkalinity enhancement, direct ocean capture. So let me jump right next to my next question, which is related around funding. Where currently, from sort of national sources in Canada, does this funding come from, and who is supportive?
I mean, there is government funding for the sort of pure research. There's a number of supported projects under various federal funding initiatives. Most of the private sector funding seems to be coming from a mix of government grants, and increasingly we're seeing private companies take advantage of advanced market commitments, so some form of I don't know if it's pre-selling or pre-buying credits. They seem to use different terms, but largely through Frontiers, which is a large US-based company that basically amalgamates funds from different companies. And so Canadian companies like Shopify and some other larger, mostly tech companies. And, I think there's an interesting nexus between the sort of tech world and the mCDR world that's maybe worth a comment. And so these are really pooled funds used to support research and development, and presumably credits that are available, sort of voluntary market credits, so not compliance market credits. Canada does have a small procurement strategy on CDR generally, but it's very small, $10 million by 2030. But the government is thinking about procurement as a strategy to encourage CDR development, and presumably that could move into the mCDR world. I know we'll talk about the compliance market and Canada's greenhouse gas offset credit system, which does not include mCDR, but does include direct air capture right now. And so there could be funding through compliance market-based credits as well, but not currently.
Great, and maybe to help visualize a little bit for those less familiar with the carbon market system, I think it's fair to say that the tech companies who seem to spend more and invest more in these pre-purchase agreements also do not yet have as many residual emissions that they need to actually offset for, because they don't run industrial processes, so they have more ability and freedom, I suppose, to do these advanced purchase agreements in the hope that eventually they deliver high quality carbon removal credits, which is not the compliance market in that sense yet, but the voluntary carbon market, to your point, Neil. So great. Let's talk about that national greenhouse gas crediting system that you already alluded to. You mentioned that direct air capture is already recognized. What do you think, generally speaking, from that system or within that system, is necessary for policymakers in order to recognize potential mCDR solutions in the future, or how far is the discussion about integrating it potentially?
I don't think the discussion is progressed at all at a policy level in Canada. I think the government is grappling with CDR technologies that have much more straightforward monitoring, reporting, and verification protocols. With direct air capture, of course, you can very closely and clearly monitor the amount of carbon dioxide you're storing, because you can monitor it through in injection wells. And so you know exactly how much, which is very important for the credibility of any crediting system. I'm sure we'll get into this, but the marine carbon dioxide space is still very much exploring the parameters of how to quantify the amount of carbon that actually would be removed from the atmosphere. And it's very complex because it's often quite indirect and cannot be monitored except through modeling. And so there are, as far as I'm aware, no discussion of the development of protocols within the government. I think they see this as probably something that will develop in the private sector through the providers, and then will sort of filter up, which is not dissimilar to what happened in direct air capture, that you had a lot of activity. We've had direct air capture in Canada in an experimental way for quite a while now, and so we're just moving to incorporating it into our compliance market. So I suspect it's some ways off.
All right, thanks for that, Neil. And so let's move on and talk a bit about national governance of marine carbon removal. And Sarah, let's start with you. Can you explain Canada's multi-jurisdictional framework for regulating marine carbon removal activities and how that complicates governance of these approaches, or does it complicate it?
I think, unfortunately, everything that has an environmental dimension in Canada is complicated from a governance perspective, and that's truly quite unfortunate. The basic situation is that our 1867 Constitution divides powers between the federal government and the provinces. There are also some territories now. And essentially, there has been a tremendous amount of litigation, which is often brought by fossil fuel producing provinces, contesting what they view as sort of federal overreach in climate related laws. And so that includes recently the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, also the Impact Assessment Act, and including its consideration of climate related impacts. So that's the context in which, so for example, if the federal government were suddenly to propose a law that might address various things, it's the constitutional division of powers would clearly inform its structure, and litigation would be unfortunately likely. But the basic division is that the federal government has jurisdiction over navigation and shipping, sea, coast, inland fisheries, also ocean dumping under national concern doctrine, has used the criminal law power to justify the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is relevant for implementation of London Convention obligations. Provinces have powers that include matters of a local and private nature within the province. The question then becomes what is within the province, and this includes inland waters, so harbors, bays, estuaries, but the scope depends on how the coastal province's jurisdiction was understood at the time it entered Confederation, so it's different depending on which province that you're in. This leads to questions like how do we understand jurisdiction over the Georgia Strait in BC or the Bay of Fundy in the Nova Scotia, New Brunswick context, but it's also led to, in some contexts, a policy of shared jurisdiction. So you see this in relation to offshore energy, first oil and gas, and now green energy in the Atlantic Canadian region, with the passing of Accord Acts by the federal government that then are implemented in parallel in the provinces. So that, I think, is an interesting and important aspect to explore. And then the added piece that's important to have on the table is the Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, which recognizes and affirms Aboriginal rights, First Nations, Métis, Inuit. This has also given rise to a lot of litigation over how to understand the duty to consult and accommodate. And again, the complexity is that in some parts of Canada, there are historic treaties. In some parts, there are modern land claims agreements. In other places, there's sort of a spectrum of inherent rights and title. Some recognized, some claimed, some unresolved. And so for the purpose of marine CDR, we need to know that some Indigenous peoples, for example, claim title to ocean ice, to ocean water. courts have very clearly recognized rights to marine mammal protection and to fisheries. And so that, again, is another important piece of the sort of, governance challenge that people need to understand in the Canadian context.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. Yeah, it is indeed complicated. And, I see some parallels in terms of some of the things that we see in the United States, including questions of consultation with tribes here, and some questions in terms of division of responsibility between states and the national government. But it sounds even a little more labyrinthine there than here. So thanks for that explanation. So Neil, what's the role of Canada's Oceans Act in regulating either the research or the deployment of mCDR approaches?
Yeah, I mean, I view the Oceans Act as less of a regulatory act and more of a planning act. The Oceans Act really is the act that allows the government, the federal government, so it's a federal act, and under the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and the main powers are around marine spatial planning, and so it's the act that allows the government to develop integrated coastal management plans, which may be relevant for certain kinds of mCDR, particularly mCDR forms that require stationary activities. So you could think of solid carbons activities, which have an injection site offshore. You could think of macroalgae, so growing seaweed, which might interfere with shipping, could interfere with fisheries. So things that take up space. But even deposition type activities may also require some spatial planning, because I think there's some potential for different kinds of use conflicts or use concerns. The Act also is the way in which Canada implements its marine protected area responsibilities. And so Canada has developed a number of marine protected areas. So to cordon off certain uses or to restrict uses in the ocean in order to protect ecosystems. And so Canada has actually been quite active in the development of marine protected areas. It's quite unclear as to how mCDR activities are going to interface with marine protected areas. I think it's going to be very technology dependent and very impact dependent. And until we really understand the impacts of different kinds of mCDR on different kinds of ecosystem functions, I think it's where I think that role is going to unfold. There's also a sort of a broad strategy. So Canada has an ocean strategy. It's quite old, and I don't think they've updated it, but they have sort of sub strategies, so blue economy strategies and things like that. We have not seen, and Sarah might know more about this than me, but we have not seen mCDR showing up in blue economy strategies, except maybe some sort of coastal restoration kinds of activities. But beyond that, but I would see that as a logical starting point for the government to start exploring what it thinks the role of mCDR is going to be and how it fits into a broader oceans policy for Canada.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things there, right? I mean, I think your kind of overarching theme, which is we'll see in a lot of cases, right? And we're coming to that we'll see moment, right? It's going to be interesting, and I think your discussion of marine protected areas is interesting. We're going to talk about BBNJ later, right? But in a lot of countries, right, the role of protected areas and trying to ascertain what that will mean in terms of potential restrictions, whether it be spatial or temporal or in operation for mCDR approaches will be an interesting thing to see as we start to operationalize it. So, Sarah, are there other key pieces of Canadian legislation that are important to understand in the context of marine carbon removal research or deployment?
Yeah, so I think there one can approach this from many different perspectives. And I'm going to kind of leave aside the climate laws more generally and focus in on a couple that are more ocean specific. So one example would be the Fisheries Act, which clearly prohibits death of fish other than by fishing. It prohibits the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat, and it prohibits the deposit of deleterious substances in water frequented by fish. So you could see mCDR right away is going to run into a situation where regulatory permits are going to be required too, which may be subject to conditions depending again on what's being proposed. Similarly, the Species at Risk Act prohibits the killing and harming of listed species and the destruction of their critical habitats. That includes aquatic species. These might be identified through a critical habitat order or some statement by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And again, the department can review to determine what kind of destruction might be anticipated and whether things can be permitted and under what conditions. So I think those are two really key pieces. And I will say that they have been invoked in many environmental impact assessment contexts, and are really important pieces of legislation, I think, for people to sort of grapple with and understand. So impact assessment laws more broadly, of course, are pretty key, and there are many others that could be called into play depending on what's at issue. And of course, noting that multi-jurisdictional layer, there are going to be provincial versions or equivalents of some of these, depending on where you are and what's at stake. So that's just a sample.
If I may just add a follow-up question there, since you in the beginning of the episode already alluded to several, research trial or company trials in the water, how have those navigated these complexities?
My understanding is that they have attempted very much to comply with whatever the existing requirements are, and at least from reading some of the comments that some have made, they've found that working with some regulators has been much easier than with others in terms of getting sort of clear feedback on whether what they're doing seems to be okay. In other cases, it's been more just a sort of a situation of silence. But I think another question that comes up is to the extent that at least the research activities are being carried out in conjunction with some other activities that are already underway, the question is whether they can sort of sneak in under the permits that are already in place. And that's also been something that's come up. But my sense is that there is a sense of uncertainty as to exactly how different approaches are being understood and what this means for the permitting process.
There were recent hearings in the Fisheries and Oceans Senate Standing Committee on ocean carbon sequestration, and I was wondering, Sarah, if there was anything from those hearings that might be pertinent to mCDR activities.
Yeah. So Neil did, in fact, participate in these hearings, and I have just read through the transcripts. And I will say that from my end, there are a few things that I think are quite interesting that come out. I mean, first is very definitely this strong emphasis that CDR is complementary, not a replacement for carbon reduction strategies. That it's an emerging technology, that it's to be approached with both enthusiasm and caution, while aware of the urgency of the situation. And as I noted earlier, there's this sense that regulators are taking a wait-and-see approach. One thing that came up frequently was reference to the importance of ensuring social license for marine carbon dioxide removal and what might be required to secure this. So a lot of discussion of community engagement, information sharing, and how this might play out. I think particularly interesting interventions were made by Ken Paul, a member of the Wolastoqey First Nation, so from Mi'kma'ki out here, sharing what he would describe as his Indigenous perspective, being aware that Indigenous perspectives are going to differ across the country. And I think there are a few things that were quite important from what he said. First is there's a tendency sometimes to think that we need this kind of overarching governance body that's going to kind of solve the situation for across Canada. And he pushed back against that, suggesting that, you might need quite different approaches depending on whether you're on the West Coast, the East Coast, or you're in the Arctic. that it's really important for Indigenous communities to be involved in sort of co-design of initiatives, and respect for self-determination is pretty crucial. And then he noted, and I think we see this also in the BBNJ and other contexts, he sort of queried how it's possible to ensure respect for this common Indigenous view of the ocean as a living being with a spirit, which we're all in a relationship with, not as a problem to be solved. So I think that's worth at least reflecting on how to kind of think about, the challenge of framing and engagement and that. And one other, I guess, piece that I thought was interesting was West Coast environmental laws, suggestion of the importance maybe of undertaking strategic assessment under the Impact Assessment Act as a one pathway forward. And then finally, just, there was a lot of interesting discussion, I think, by researchers and also industry partners on the need for clear regulatory pathways, but also the need to kind of keep the funding for research separate from the commercialization, even though it's very embedded, I think, in some of the funding systems that the researchers and industry must work together. So that's all I'll say on that, although I'm sure Neil may have other pieces to add.
Yeah, anything else, Neil?
I mean, I just comment maybe on one of Sarah's comments, because I think it's interesting, which is the difference, the potential difference between the East and the West Coast. And one example that I think might be telling is aquaculture. And so the way aquaculture works in Canada is dramatically different on the East Coast, where we actually have a lot of aquaculture. It's quite a big industry in Eastern Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. It's quite well accepted as a part of the ocean economy. In Western Canada, for a variety of reasons, including sea lice outbreaks and concerns, aquaculture was had sort of a lower social license and much more concern, much more active opposition to it. And so we may actually see quite different kind of levels of how publics engage with something like mCDR on the coasts as a result of the kinds of activities that are going on out there, the ways in which First Nations interact with the marine environment. So in Eastern Canada, there's a very, very active, on both coasts, there's a very, very active Indigenous fisheries, which is a large source of income for Indigenous communities on both coasts. So I think understanding those intricacies makes me think that we are going to have a kind of fine-grained, that a kind of one-size-fits-all regulatory approach is less likely because of those reasons. The other thing that I was sort of struck with at the hearings is there is a fair amount of government enthusiasm for the kind of potential sort of economic R&D driven solutions to climate. I think a lot of government actors are interested in technical solutions. There was a fair amount of enthusiasm from the certain members of the committee. And justifiably so. There are some exciting technologies. There are some Canadian companies, Planetary and Carbon Run, that look to be global leaders in developing these technologies. And I guess the question is how that's going to be tempered with the risks associated with these activities. And I think the point that Sarah made about the direction and the certainty is really going to be the key point going forward. And we're seeing this not only in Canada, but globally, that right now it's very unclear what the pathway from experimentation to deployment looks like, and under what conditions are regulators going to look at experimental activity and say this is now suitable for scaling up and larger scale and presumably credit generation? And I think that's going to be really the key question around mCDR for the next 10 years.
Yeah, well, you teed up that next question then very easily, Neil. What does it look like right now in Canada in terms of regulation of research on marine carbon removal?
I'd say it's default regulation. And so if a existing regulation applies, then it will be applied. And I think it's fair to say that researchers and experimenters are trying their hardest to comply and work with regulators. At small scales, many of the traditional forms of that might regulate sort of field research are not being triggered. So impact assessments right now are not being triggered because the expected impacts are so small that they're just not triggering environmental impact assessments. That may change. The government may include certain kinds of mCDR activities as requiring impact assessments. So really, it's just a matter of licensing. And so there might be licenses, provincial licenses for the use of outfalls. So some of the ocean alkalinity projects are using sewage outfalls, right? So they're just adding alkaline material to sewage disposal plants that are disposing into the water. And so they can either piggyback onto, as Sarah said, existing licenses or add to them. We are seeing in Canada, as in elsewhere, I think to fill this gap, researchers developing private codes of conduct. So I think the proliferation of private codes of conduct is actually a really interesting area. I keep encouraging my graduate students to go and sort of create a database of all the private codes of conduct in this area, because there's so many of them, and how many of them are consistent. They tend to be very broad stroke documents, and so they're not regulatory documents. They're more kind of vision and strategy documents, but at least setting out the kind of ethical framework for the conduct of mCDR.
I wanted to chime in there for a second and clarify perhaps something. You mentioned that environmental impact assessments are currently not being triggered. I just wanted to maybe provide more or understand that a little bit better and provide more nuance to that, because the activities that are going on, the research or private collaborations, they are of course collecting data and observing for ecological parameters, etc. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you see that being different from official, like regulatory level environmental impact assessments?
Well, regulatory level impact assessments are ex ante assessments of, before the activity occurs, prior environmental assessments of predicted environmental impacts. But in Canada, as in many other places, typically we designate different kinds of projects that require environmental impact assessments. The whole, and this goes back to Sarah's first comment, the whole area of environmental impact assessment right now in Canada is in a little bit of chaos because the federal act was successfully challenged on constitutional grounds as a matter of overreach. I think that the government has pretty clear jurisdictions over ocean activities. But you can take a project like an ocean alkalinity experiment, which is using a pipe outflow. And so the pipe is, that's really a provincial regulation. It's probably happening in inland waters. It may trigger a federal approval through the Fisheries Act if it's expected that the alkaline material could affect a fishery. And I think as it scales up, then it's much more likely. In terms of what's going on in terms of the publication, so one of the ways in which we might sensibly regulate experimentation is through transparency measures, right? And so to what degree are we requiring mCDR researchers to be very transparent about what they're doing, to share their data, and I have not seen that done in a formalized way, but I haven't. I have to say I haven't looked hard to see if it's being done. I'm sure it's being done in an informal way in discussions with regulators, and it's obviously being done in a kind of academic way, and that the data is being collected by academics who will be producing papers, and so it'll be peer reviewed and shared in that in that regard. So again, I see sort of research regulation in Canada right now as just a kind of, like I said, default regulation and a sort of benign neglect.
Yeah, I just wanted to double check on that. Like the projects that are in the water are not, necessarily doing the typical environmental impact assessments that might be needed, but collecting a multitude of ecological parameters both before and after. And so far as I know, the companies and projects have shared data, have provided data, and have not seen any like bad effects. More so, even if so, they've seen positive effects, right? But that's not to say that at scale, obviously, these assessments need to be carried out, and using these hybrid approaches by using existing infrastructure is also a potential stepping stone, right? It's also a potential to sort of use existing infrastructure to answer key research questions in order to assess if we should scale and if we can safely and efficiently scale.
So let's expand our purview a bit, Neil. And Canada is a party to the London Convention and the London Protocol. How do they implement these treaties nationally?
So the London Protocol is implemented through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which has a dumping at sea section. It's implemented in a very kind of literal way, in that the wording of the London Protocol is more or less imported into the Act. The London Protocol is quite a precise treaty, and the licensing is done. So you need under the London Protocol, you need a license if you're engaging in, either dumping is allowed, but those kinds of dumping activities that would be allowed would be licensed by Environment and Climate Change Canada under the Act. And so right now the Act reflects the protocol as it stands.
Yeah. Are there any live applications right now? We have one in the United States under the MPRSA, right, which implements the London Convention here. Are there any in Canada that you know of?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So other question, as everybody probably knows, there is an amendment to the London Protocol to regulate quote unquote marine geoengineering approaches, and I believe only 6 countries have accepted that amendment at this point. And I think we need like 37 for it to come into force. I was wondering if there's any discussion or move afoot in Canada to accept that amendment.
If there is, I mean, generally the Canadian government keeps their cards close to their chest on these kinds of things. They and there has been some consultations on the London Protocol and mCDR generally, but largely in terms of some of the negotiations that are ongoing about adding other kinds of technologies to it. And so I haven't seen anything or heard from anyone as to where the Canadian government is, although I have recommended that it might be a sensible thing for the government to do, but I don't think that's having much effect on the Canadian government.
They don't always listen to us academics. It's just hard. It's hard to believe, but I guess it's true.
It's entirely easy to believe, actually.
So Sarah, we've briefly adverted to BBNJ already, and I thought some of your other responses and Neil's response that talked about things that would be pertinent, I think, in BBNJ in terms of mCDR, including the role of Indigenous knowledge, the role of Indigenous participation in that process, and the potential role of strategic environmental impact assessments. And I was wondering if there's any real discussion in Canada right now about ratifying BBNJ, and if you had any additional thoughts on how that might impact how mCDR gets regulated.
So I admit I, like Neil, have no inside knowledge on, although maybe Neil has inside knowledge on BBNJ, but I do not. I will say that certainly the outward signals are very positive, at least with the current federal government. And of course, one of our challenges right now is we're anticipating a change in Prime Minister shortly, and possibly an election soon after that. And it's entirely anyone's guess as to what's going to happen then. If we keep the current government, I would think that there are very strong indications that they might ratify. And this again, goes back to their real commitments to marine protected areas and protected areas more generally, to the work going on under the Biodiversity Convention, the Kunming biodiversity framework. And as you've alluded to already, a key piece of that being the way in which Indigenous rights and engagement are very much integrated into these biodiversity frameworks, and that includes BBNJ. And so I think that's an area where at least the current government feels quite strongly, and that they can and would like to continue to play a key part. And I was also going to, as you've already alluded to, just sort of point to, I think, the impact assessment processes that are in there, and including the possibility of strategic assessment, signaling that this might be quite a good move from Canada's perspective, and provide some very useful tools for mCDR regulation, possibly moving forward.
All right. So to close it off, let's do a quick round on MRV regulations in Canada. We obviously alluded to some of the rules and implications already when talking about the environmental impact assessments that may become more prominent in larger scale scenarios. Broadly speaking, where do the rules and protocols come from for quantification of MRV in Canada? So if we keep the environmental impact assessments aside for a second, in order to estimate and assess the amount of CDR that was removed, what should folks be thinking about?
Well, in compliance markets, it will come from offset rules. And so if we would anticipate that one of the pathways for mCDR will be, it will generate credits, and those credits will be sold into compliance markets for use by companies to offset their greenhouse gas reduction commitments. And so in Canada right now, we have a fairly robust climate pricing system. And so we have a national greenhouse gas pollution act, which and we have a price on carbon, and that price accelerates, and that price applies to what we call sort of output-based sort of industrial. So we have a gas tax, and then we have an industrial imposition. And so we've seen, as I think we mentioned, the direct air capture they have developed a protocol for that, and so it would have to follow that route in the compliance market and voluntary markets. I think that the voluntary markets will generate their own protocols, and for procurement measures, the government may just develop sort of internal, but it doesn't really need to do the accounting. Unless it's claiming those reductions in its national accounts. And then, of course, we'll need to see some development of protocols through the Paris Agreement, whether it's under Article 6 sort of market-based activities, or just in the sort of accounting framework there. There's all sorts of issues with MRV and marine carbon dioxide removal that are probably you've covered in other forums, because they're quite difficult to understand how they're going to develop. But we're seeing them being developed privately, right? And so there's private companies like Isometric that are developing protocols. So there are existing protocols out there, and I presume that those protocols being developed by private companies, but very science-based companies, will lead the way in this area.
So on the note of difficult, challenging MRV in the oceans, as you said, we've covered it in ample other episodes. It comes down to a combination of measurements and computational models, of course. One thing that is quite interesting, and I think particularly challenging in the oceans, is that at some point, projects, companies cannot continue monitoring the wide open ocean. And I wonder how you think about sort of the handover between project level monitoring and more national shared ocean observation infrastructure in Canada, and if there are good examples, or if we leave this question to the future solutions.
We have an oceans observations ecosystem in Canada. MIOPAR is very active in the development of ocean observations. Many of the large global scale ocean observation projects are international collaborations, and so Canada participates in some of those. And I guess the question is going to be really, I think, one of scale and division of labor. And so what is going to be the responsibility of national governments? What is going to be the responsibility of sort of international consortia of research groups? But I think the observational requirements are, for scaled mCDR would be quite significant and would require significant international cooperation.
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to add something to that?
Just that I agree. I think there's certainly a lot of work going on with Dalhousie researchers and others on ocean observation, but I think there is no question that a lot of this work is done collaboratively with international partners. And of course, this includes U.S. government institutions. So what are the implications of U.S. cuts for Canadian research and observation potential? This is something I don't know the answer to, but I anticipate chatting with colleagues about.
Okay, well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground or water at this point. And once again, thanks to Sarah and Neil for joining us and providing a really rich sort of discussion about what's happening in Canada in terms of mCDR. And Anna, as always, a pleasure. If you like the show, please leave a favorable review on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be back again soon with another episode. And so goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.